Hello and welcome to Emerging Viewpoints. I'm Nick Stottmiller. Today we're joined by David Roberts to discuss Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's rise to power, his ambitious Vision 2030 project, and Saudi and other Gulf states' foreign policy as they attempt to balance their relationships with the United States and with Russia and China. Dr. Roberts is an associate professor in the Defense Studies Department at King's College London, adjunct faculty at Sciences Po, and a non-resident fellow at Arab Gulf States Institute, Washington. He is the author of Qatar, Securing the Global Ambitions of a City-State. David, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invite. Pleasure to discuss these things.
So Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MbS, is widely seen as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, at least when it comes to everyday affairs. Now, his father, King Salman, is reportedly in ill health, and although Mohammed bin Salman is widely expected to accede to the throne quite easily, I've heard a bit of speculation that the succession process may not be quite as smooth as some suspect. And my guess is a lot of the speculation around the succession process has to do with its sheer opacity. So, David, could you talk us through the succession process and what you expect to happen this time around?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really good question. I like the way you phrase it. You've got the right element of skepticism, and you speak to the opacity, and I think those are some of the key elements. And so, the broad expectation is that it might be smooth. There are always a few sort of questions and quirks and a few op-eds around the edges, but the general tenor of what we kind of think at the moment, the scholarly community at the moment, is that Mohammed bin Salman, he has centralized power in Saudi Arabia, basically like no one else before him, to be honest. I mean, the sentiment of how does power and succession work in Saudi Arabia, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and for decades before, we said, well, there are different groups within the Al Saud, different elements of the family that have certain amounts of power themselves. Perhaps different ones had its own fiefdom in defense or in the sort of foreign affairs or wherever it may be. And a modus vivendi needed to be reached between these competing sections of the family. That was the reality as we understood it. But with the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, he has swept away a lot of these norms and understandings, to be honest. He created a couple of very important and influential groups, effectively, with him at the head of them in the economic sphere and in the security sphere, and thereby cutting out the impact, the say-so of a lot of Saudis who hitherto were considered to be really quite important. And so there's this centralization, like I say, and so he's the crown prince today. He's quite close to his father by all accounts. And so, yes, we sort of assume that he will ascend to power. The last thing I'll say here is that there is this body called the Allegiance Council that was set up in 2006, 2007, that was there to formalize the rise to power of a crown prince or a deputy crown prince, and indeed to king, whereby that there would be a vote among senior Saudis, and they would give their assent to someone taking on one of the top jobs. But what we have seen since then is that this Allegiance Council, this attempt at creating a structure, a clear structure in this otherwise pretty opaque issue of Saudi succession, well, it's become far more of a rubber stamp council. And I'll just give you one sort of quick example. When King Abdullah, King Salman's predecessor, he wanted to put in line, so there was King Abdullah, then there was Crown Prince Salman, and Abdullah wanted to institute Mukrin, one of his brothers, as the deputy crown prince, and he used the Allegiance Council to do this. Mukrin was voted on, and the wording that Abdullah sort of foisted in was, and this decision cannot be changed. Really, it can't. Honestly, this time, truly, it can't be changed by anyone. And this was done in 2014. But within a couple of months, 3 months of Salman acceding to the throne, he moved Mukrin aside, moved Mohammed bin Nayef up firstly, and then secondly, later on, his son Mohammed bin Salman. My point is that the Allegiance Council is important until it's not. And so our best guess is that it is, like I say, more of a rubber stamp process that Mohammed bin Salman will use after the fact to certify his position.
Do you think there's anything that Mohammed bin Salman would like to do that he might feel unable to do as crown prince and the day-to-day de facto ruler that he might feel empowered to do as king? I mean, are there any changes that we could see if and when MbS becomes the king?
Well, the changes that Mohammed bin Salman has instituted have been absolutely seismic already. The vast expansion of the role of women in society, the creation of these new cities, a lot of fiddling with the governance of Saudi Aramco, not the creation of the PIF, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but very significantly changing what the Saudi sovereign wealth funds are doing. So he has already had immense impact. An awful lot of those policies have already broken a lot of taboos in many ways. And so there aren't many things left whereby he might feel a bit restricted. I suppose the one area might be to do with relations with Israel. Of course, just a few hours ago, I think it was, the Emiratis signed a free trade agreement with Israel, a very significant trade agreement with Israel at the very least. And they, of course, led a lot of the engagement with Israel in recent years, despite low-level engagement from Qatar and Oman going back decades. But the Emiratis by far went the furthest of any Gulf state in ever, pretty much. And Saudi has not followed along those sorts of lines. The sentiment is that, speaking to, I think, to the crux of your question, that it is still quite a transgressive, taboo issue, the idea of engaging with Israel when there is no reasonable or just solution to the Palestinian kind of a question. Maybe Saudi sentiment would still be against it. Maybe King Salman, again, the ideas are, maybe he is still against it. So this is one possible area where we might see change. And the last thing I'll mention is that Mohammed bin Salman has driven like a train through a variety of very strongly held taboos in recent years, things that we did not think were possible, that were these norms in Saudi Arabia, that we thought were, if not set in stone, were, very significantly entrenched. And he's just blown through them left and right. And so once again, we do think broadly that, it would not be an easy thing to engage with Israel. But we need to keep in mind the nature of Mohammed bin Salman and how the kinds of changes he does kind of intimate, push through.
You talked about some of the tremendous change that we've seen as in tandem with MbS's rise to power. And many of the reforms that you mentioned are closely tied to his ambitious Vision 2030 program, a plan to transform the Saudi economy and society. And on the economic front, I would say that the verdict is probably still not in, although there have been some early, very promising reforms. The fate of some of these mega cities, such as Neom, which are still years away from being completed, is unknown. It's unknowable at this point. But to me, one of the most striking and significant changes that we've seen is decoupling the government's fiscal policy from the oil cycle. In previous cycles, when oil prices fell, the government would tighten its belt. And then when oil prices went back up, you would see profligate spending. You would see a lot of this money sort of thrown out in the form of subsidies, handouts, bonuses to public sector employees. But this time genuinely feels different. We've seen a tremendous rise in oil prices, and yet the authorities seem very committed to maintaining fiscal discipline. So, David, what's changed in the political economy that's allowed the government to do this? Because in previous cycles, there was a lot of political pressure to increase spending when oil revenues went up. So, what's different this time?
Indeed. I mean, we have been speaking in the Gulf, or our friends in the Gulf have been speaking for more than half a century about the need to decouple in many ways their economies from oil and gas, but mostly oil. The need to diversify the economies. It's been a buzzword for a very long time, and you can find projects and plans by McKinsey and the likes back in the 80s promoting ways to diversify the Saudi economy and other economies in the Gulf. But almost no leaders have really taken it seriously. Leaders only tend to do something meaningful and proactive about, like we were saying, decoupling or diversifying the economy when they absolutely have to, which is why Dubai, Bahrain to a lesser degree, pretty much without significant oil supplies, the devil forces you to do these things, as it were. And so they've had to do it, and so they have kind of done it. They have done it rather. What's a little bit different in Saudi this time is that I think Mohammed bin Salman, quite singularly himself, he has understood this kind of a dynamic. And I think we can see a lot of the changes that he's instituted, desperately not unpopular, but shaking changes that he has intimated, he's driven through rather. I think they are driven by this understanding that it's a bit now or never, that the nature of the Saudi economy, it just absolutely must change. He sees this as a shock therapy of sorts, that, in 20 or 30 years, within an obvious kind of a lifespan here, the world economy might look very difficult. One of the central Saudi adages is, the Stone Age did not end because they ran out of stone. And so the sentiment of, having the oil sort of economy as everything centered around oil, driving everything. I think the Saudis are very worried that the economy, like I said, broader world economy, if you will just move away and it'll be left high and dry. So I think Mohammed bin Salman has had a decent grasp of this idea and wants to try something really quite new. Now, whether these sorts of grandiose new economic cities are the answer to this is a very different question. He is not the first Saudi leader to attempt to catalyze the Saudi economy in this kind of a way. King Abdullah tried to build 6 or 7 massive new economic cities. He wanted them to, hold millions of individuals, new industry and the likes. And by the standards and the goals that he set, they have been a complete failure. All of these cities, only a couple have even been half built. And even the ones that are built, by no means do they reach what was hoped for them. So my expectations are that Neom, or at least the core of it, will be built, as it were. We keep seeing ever more outlandish plans getting added to it. So there's the line, this thin city over some dozens of kilometers through the desert. I mean, whether these extra, vast, grandiose building plans will come to fruition, I'm less confident, as it were. I'm not sure about that. And, one of the not central, but one of the more interesting books, at least in kind of social sciences, looking at these things, is James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State. And it's a wonderful book, decrying the impossibility of undertaking these kinds of gargantuan problems, just about individuals or elites or governments building new capital cities. This is another example about how they often struggle significantly. And I do worry about the state-driven nature of so many of these problems. I don't think that's particularly because I've got a particular economic perspective on it. I just do think states inevitably struggle to direct from afar these kinds of affairs, but perhaps I'll be wrong.
So you mentioned earlier some of the major social reforms that Mohammed bin Salman has pushed through, such as increased participation of women in society and the workforce. And I'm wondering, to what extent should we see these social reforms as linked to the economic reform agenda? is it a case where you can't have one without the other, or is this a sort of broad modernization drive that's just sweeping across all aspects of society, from the social to the economic sphere?
I think we've got to see them as completely inseparable. My new book, available in bookshops maybe by the end of the year, who knows, looks at kind of continuity and change here. It looks at contemporary Gulf history across the six Gulf monarchies. And I was looking at the concept of security as securing and stabilizing the Gulf monarchies. And, as you go back through the history and you come on to today, I mean, it sounds like a facile point to make, but to the central thrumming lesson that comes back time and time and time again is the pivotal and immense shaping power and force of the oil kind of economy. So the changes that we are speaking of, they are economic changes, but absolutely they are societal, they are political as well. Because it's not just about, an economy, it's about citizens' expectations of what the government ought to provide. It's about that people to government kind of relationship. And the literature has long created these ideas of the rentier economy, these governments that are dependent on the rent, as it's described, the income that comes from oil or gas or indeed other minerals, and about the effects that these types of economies have on state and society relations, about the expectations that individuals have. And there were concerns about what's called the rentier mentality, as it were. Quite empirically rich evidence speaking about the kinds of expectations that individuals have. I did a lot. I've lived in Qatar for a number of years, and speaking to college students, for example, graduating from often wonderful universities, their expectations and demands are absolutely to go into the workforce with a very good wage packet at a quite senior level. The idea of working your way up is kind of anathema. I mean, this is a big handful generalization, but my goodness, these sorts of findings are found throughout the Gulf. So this was a broad understanding, and it is something we need to keep in mind. But at the same time, if you speak to anyone who's been to the kingdom, 10 years ago and last month, in unison, what they say is, my goodness, there has been a change in the Saudi workforce. Now you will see more Saudi taxi drivers, Saudis in the shops, Saudis holding the door at the hotel, these sorts of things. And so there have been real instances of progress here. Again, speaking to this sort of evolution of the ruling bargain. So you have Mohammed bin Salman leading from the front, as it were, creating these grandiose projects. But there does seem to be significant change within society itself, kind of coming with him in some sort of a way. And the last point I'll make is that we also see this in terms of taxes. The Gulf is famously, historically, one of the lowest tax environments in the world. But in places like Saudi Arabia, Oman, the UAE, we have seen VAT increase, for example. A lot of other indirect taxes have kind of crept up in recent years. And that hasn't exploded this ruling bargain. People are so far, at least in Saudi, seeming to take on this new understanding of the approach of a new fiscal reality. And as long as, it's a very big sentiment, but as long as Mohammed bin Salman can kind of offer Saudi's a very young population, a lot of people graduating, as long as he can promise or offer reasonable opportunities for a good number of these young Saudis, Saudi will perhaps bumble along perfectly well in the near term. But that is a very tricky balance to strike, to the continual sort of provision of opportunity, of course.
On the theme about striking balances, I'd like to shift the discussion over to foreign policy. Now, historically, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states have enjoyed very deep relationships with the United States, particularly on defense and security matters. But more recently, you've seen Saudi Arabia deepening its relationship with Russia in terms of oil policy cooperation in the OPEC Plus format. and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in particular, and other Gulf states deepening their relationship with China, particularly as trade links between the Gulf and China and the rest of Asia have deepened quite a lot in recent years. And I'd like to ask you, David, do you think that the Gulf states can maintain a balancing act between the relationship with the US on the one hand and with Russia and China on the other, particularly as the relationship between the US and those countries becomes more confrontational?
Indeed. So it's an interesting question. There'll certainly be a balance. I mean, when it comes to the US relationship with the Gulf, I I think quite strongly that we will come back to look at the 14th of September 2019 as an inflection point in contemporary Gulf history. As you may remember, in September 14th, 2019, there were attacks, drone and missile attacks on Saudi oil facilities in Khurais and Abqaiq being the world's most important oil facility. These facilities were protected, of course. They've been protected for a very long time by US defenses in some cases, by the Saudis buying an awful lot of US equipment. But nevertheless, Houthi, we think, or Iranian proxies at least, drones and missiles threw unopposed through these defenses and struck very accurately at the world's most important oil refining facility. I think this was a tremendous shock and wake-up call for Saudi Arabia and for the Gulf monarchies. Saudi and the other Gulf monarchies, but particularly Saudi, have had 50, 60 years of tricky but close relations with the US. The central premise of this relationship has been that, like I say, it's never been easy for the Saudis to have this close relationship with the US. Saudi Arabia has long been concerned about Israel, the US support of Israel at the expense of the Palestinians, for example. But the bargain has been that, well, you know, Uncle Sam is really important, the world's preeminent military power. It has spectacular military technology. And if we have this difficult relationship, at least we'll be protected. That's the basis of kind of that relationship, I think. And the Abqaiq moment, September 2019, showed that actually, no, that the US technology did not prevent the attack. It did not stop the attack. The close US relations, the US military bases festooned around the Arabian Peninsula did not politically deter this kind of an attack. And what was the reaction of the Trump administration? Absolutely nothing useful whatsoever. And so what, therefore, from the Saudi perspective, is the use of this tremendously expensive relationship, expensive at the very least, in terms of the tens upon tens of billions of dollars in military procurements over the decades. So what's the point of this relationship if our literal number one most important oil facility can be attacked by a few drones and a few missiles? I think this was an absolutely shaking moment for Saudi and the Gulf monarchies. But what are their options? What happens now? So if you've come to some sort of realization, perhaps, about the US emperor lacking a few garments or two here or there when it comes to deep security issues like that, and you see, it's not just about that incident, it's about a growing unease with US engagement, really. It's about President Obama, Trump, Biden. There's a growing or consistency in the US unease at its continual engagement in the Gulf. But like we say, like to your question, what are the options here? There are no alternatives to US military protection, such as it is. No one is in any position whatsoever to try to replace the US military footprint, which is enormous, in the Gulf region. What we are seeing, and I think what we will see a little bit more, in like I say, a bit more in the security kind of a sphere, is more of a mosaic approach. So we have seen Britain has, of course, opened a second military base in Oman, in addition to making permanent a base in Bahrain a few years ago. So we have the Brits, as it were, back in the region. Turkey has its military base in Qatar as well. France has a military base in the UAE. And so I think we'll see a greater reliance on individuals, smaller, much smaller kind of nations, to sort of try to plug this kind of a gap. And as the US commitment sort of drops, I think that Gulf monarchies will attempt to sort of further the engagement of other states. And Qatar is a quick example here for the World Cup. It's not just the British Royal Air Force that will be providing security overflight, but apparently the Royal Navy will be providing some kind of waterborne security as well. I'm sure there's some sort of British role in the sort of logistics on the ground as well when it comes to security. And so, you know, there's that sort of a background to it. And China, to your question, I don't think we're going to see a Chinese kind of security role in the near future, at least. But of course, China have a very significant military base just around the Horn of Africa. They insisted it wasn't a military base for years and years. It's just logistics. And then, ta-da, one day they revealed it, festooned with tanks and troops. So that is there. And underlying your question, of course, is, you know, the direction of travel of all the trade of the oil, with the Gulf region being so pivotal to China for energy imports. And so we'll definitely see China's gradual increase in engagement. At one stage, an American administration will pull the plug. It's anytime, I guess, but I mean, I don't expect it in the coming years or decades, but it'll happen eventually, of course. And then I think we'll see more of a indigenous reliance and like a slightly mosaic approach, like I say, sharing the burdens around a bit more, perhaps.
Well, have we seen an increased self-reliance in the Gulf? In other words, instead of just depending on the Americans or other Western partners to provide defense, is there a move for that to be provided indigenously with perhaps foreign-bought equipment?
So yes and no is the answer to that question. The war in Yemen, driven by Saudi Arabia and the UAE in recent years, demonstrates that Saudi Arabia has very limited military capability, despite many decades and considerable expense building the equipment, as it were, importing it, trying to get the Saudis to work with it. Their effectiveness is highly limited. So the indigenous reliance in Saudi Arabia is not there at the moment. And how quickly you can turn that around is a long kind of a conversation. I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman has aspirations, but it's an oil tanker to turn around, and will be very difficult. There is, in the form of the UAE and at least their presidential guard, there is an example of how a Gulf monarchy can build meaningful local indigenous military kind of capability. The presidential guard is a bit like the US Marines or the Royal Marines in the UK. It's not just an elite protection unit. And in a few instances in Yemen, particularly in Aden, we saw them undertake a very successful amphibious landing, pivoting into a coin operation that no one thought they would be able to do. It's not to say that everything went well and everything subsequently, and subsequently they struggled a bit when they went further north, without a doubt. But the initial operation, at least, was remarkably successful. And so there is an approach driven by Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE. If you want military capability, he shows you how to do it. Just very briefly, one of the key things that Mohammed bin Zayed did was that the head of the presidential guard is an Australian, the former head of the Australian SAS, General Mike Hindmarsh. So that's how one of the key plinths to it, but that's not replicable probably anywhere else, I would have thought. So it's difficult. And if we just contrast the Emirati approach with Qatar, well, Qatar certainly have the military equipment, but the obvious example is that they have 3 wonderful fast jets, as it were, British, American, and French leading fast jets. But no procurement officer in the world would suggest that you buy 3 hyper expensive, hyper technical, different fast jets from 3 different states, because the interoperability of them is nightmarish. My point is that they have not really bought those 3 different fast jets as a mechanism to build meaningful military indigenous capability. Rather, the Qataris have seen these, it's better to invest between 10 and $15 billion in the industrial complexes in Washington, London, and Paris, they see that as a more effective way of getting security rather than focusing in a slightly more parsimonious fashion, more logical fashion, if you will, on one type of capability and making it effective in that way. So, different means to the end, but the path is there for the Saudis, but it will be immensely difficult to do, to convert their forces into capable forces. But I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman is buying a plan from McKinsey as to how that can be done.
And David, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.